Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. I really appreciate both the operational leadership team and the leadership team joining us here. And I have asked some members of the DEI committee to join us as well. So thank you for doing that. I have two guests with us today from I was going to call you an agency, from a company called Slalom. I hope I said that right. I have Jen Macias and Julian Martinez with us. Jen's going to be presenting a talk to us about inclusive design, and I'm excited to see. So I'm going to hand over the proverbial reins to Jen.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I appreciate it. And thank you all for having me. It's an honor to get to speak with you all today and talk about something for which I care deeply and align it with some really powerful things that are happening in the state of Washington in regards to the PEAR framework. So before I dive in, I'm going to do an accessibility check because we want to embody the behavior that we talk about regarding inclusion and accessibility. So any digital materials I share of this presentation will include added alt text to all the images, checked headlines outlining reading order of all the slide layouts, checked color contrast, and brief visual descriptions will be provided throughout the virtual experience. So again, this entire deck will be shared after the meeting. So if you want to refer to it, it has a bunch of notes in there as well. And I also have some resources in the end so that you don't have to strain your wrists putting down copious notes. So let's go ahead and dive in. So to build on the introduction from Kristen, yes, I am Jen Macias and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior experience designer and consultant at Slalom. I specialize in inclusive and trauma-informed design, and I also serve as an accessibility SME. There's some notifications. Okay. So, before I jump into the topic, to embody the behavior of inclusion and accessibility, I'm going to provide a brief visual description of myself. I'm a light-skinned, multiracial Latina with long brown hair, brown eyes, and a freckled face, and I'm wearing a black jacket with a green sweater. A little bit more about me so you understand the lens in which I view my work. I was the daughter of a very young couple, my father of indigenous Mexican and Chinese origins, and my mother of Greek and Croatian origins. And as a young mixed girl, I grew up in the state of Arizona during the dehumanizing political reign of Sheriff Joe Arpaio. I experienced poverty, homelessness, and became a ward of the state at a very young age. I'm a survivor of domestic violence, sexual violence, and our foster care system. So before I became to be an experienced designer, I studied biology and society at Arizona State University, ASU. And at that time, I focused on infectious disease, vaccinology, reproductive health, and education. I lived and worked in East Africa, working on a variety of science-based HIV and AIDS awareness campaigns. And upon my return, I worked at ASU's Biodesign Institute, which was a great honor to me. And that is actually where I discovered the power of information design and data visualization. My bridge career between the sciences and design was working within specialty coffee as a competitive barista and coffee educator. Yes, that is a thing. It paid for school and to help support my family, which I was at that time taking care of my sisters. So that experience ultimately led me to the Portland, Oregon, where I competed in the United States Barista Championship and then just really loved the city and decided to move here. And when I did, I put everything I had into my design career. I was introduced to accessibility while working at an ed tech company by day and volunteering to visualize the city of Portland's unhoused census data by night. And as a citizen, I've engaged with multiple local government initiatives. Most recently, I served as an advising member for a transit land use planning initiative that will have a direct impact on non-white communities across the city of Portland. So in summary, this is me and the lens from which I view my work. It's these collective experiences that fuel my desire to interrupt systemic inequities through the lens of design. So jumping into inclusive by design. I'm going to give an overview of what I mean by this term and then explore what the relationship between inclusive design looks like within the pro-equity anti-racism PEAR framework. So, what is inclusive by design? And I think when we explore this, it's important that we align on the language that we use, no matter what, but especially in this space. So it's best to break it down into two parts. When we say inclusive, when I say inclusive, what I'm referring to is a full range of human diversity. And this is probably not new to everyone here. But when I say the full range of human diversity, I'm including but not limiting to ability, age, culture, education, gender, language, neurodiversity, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background. So when we talk about design, what I mean by that is something that's made with intention. It is deliberate. It's according to a plan. And in an ideal state, we infuse empathy in our design because the real emphasis is really about who we're designing for. So I have a slide with an image and I'm going to provide a description. The description of this image is a simple block diagram showing inclusion, diversity, and equity grouped close together with the block representing accessibility separated from the rest of the blocks. And there's a gap between ID&E and accessibility that reads, why the gap? So the observation here is what I've noticed across my relatively diverse career arc as a designer and researcher is that accessibility tends to be siloed from ID&E work, which I find to be really interesting as accessibility is a function of inclusion. They work inherently together. So let's talk about the relationship between accessibility and inclusion to understand why this gap may exist and why it's important to close it. So if we distill it down to the most essential form, accessibility, I like to think of it as it's the removal of barriers. And inclusion is this impact and what's possible once those barriers are removed. So it's interesting that and understandable why we see accessibility being siloed from ID&E, but it's to really strengthen the efforts across the board. It's important to understand why they are so intrinsically tied to one another. So when it comes to inclusive design thinking, it can feel overwhelming. And a question I often hear is, where do I even start? Inclusivity feels so massive. Even looking at the PEAR framework, it's like, where do we start? This is a great framework, but what does that engagement look like? What does preparation look like? So in that context, I think it's important to acknowledge that feeling. That feeling is spot on. It is massive. But let's take a moment to reflect on why it feels that way. So inclusive design thinking, or just thinking of the topic of inclusion, often feels overwhelming because it forces us to acknowledge just how much exclusion is baked into our processes and systems. It's nothing new, it isn't sudden, it's been compounding interest in the negative over time, and it's gotten to a point where we can no longer ignore it, nor should we. So allow me to provide more context on what I mean by compounding interest in the negative, like debt. I think it's really hard to go back and fix it. And not I think, I know it's hard to go back and fix it. The created and made world is challenging to retroactively make better. And because we didn't think about this up front, we are incurring these experiences of exclusion as a form of debt, leading us to have to undo what has already been done. And that can be expensive on multiple levels, systemically, financially, cognitively, emotionally, and more. So this acknowledgement is an important step in the process. The acknowledgement of the feeling, of the magnitude, is not to be underestimated. And recognizing how much exclusion has played a part in how we engage and don't engage with one another. And oddly enough, that sense of massiveness, the overwhelmingness of it sometimes makes me think of Spider-Man. And yes, I'm an unapologetic millennial that is using a comic book reference to illustrate my point, so bear with me. I'm going to provide a description of the image that we see here. It's a Spider-Man movie scene that takes place in a cafeteria in which our main protagonist, Peter Parker, is staring at his hand in wonder as a fork mysteriously sticks to his palm. I'm going to provide additional context that comes to mind when relating to the feeling of thinking about inclusion. So, the protagonist in the scene, Peter Parker, he's recently been bitten by a spider that imbues him with a variety of powers. He's going about his day when suddenly everything he touches sticks to him. It feels more tactile. All of his senses are tuned up. He's hyper aware. He can't shake it off. Everything around him just becomes more vibrant and more vibration and maybe overwhelming. And so something as simple as a fork sticks to his palm without logic. It's like, what is this? Why is this way? So when we're stepping into the world of and the work of inclusion and inclusive design thinking, it can feel the same way. It can be challenging to navigate the world and not be overwhelmed with how much exclusion exists all around us. We can't tackle it all. Where do we start? In my experience, true sustainable and transformational change starts within ourselves. Um, so let's talk a little bit more about what that might mean. When I say that, what I really am getting at is that systemic change requires self-reflection because we're all part of this process. And there's no getting around it. No matter what role you might play in the accessibility life cycle or any equity driven system, the strongest place to start is within ourselves. Recognize where you stand in your values and what biases may have played a role in your decision making. So I would like to share some wise words from a fellow colleague, Kim Holub, one of my collaborators in the inclusive by design space. She recently conducted a workshop on inclusive journey mapping that I believe to be relevant in preparing ourselves to think more inclusively. So I have an image of a quote here, and the quote reads, "To prepare yourself to engage in inclusion work, you need to do some self-reflecting. As you have conversations around inclusion, you need to get comfortable getting uncomfortable." Just to pause here, I know we hear that a lot, but for good reason. It's important that we repeat this mantra to ourselves. So to continue the quote, there will likely be conversations that identify gaps or unintentional barriers within current experiences. Maybe you were part of setting up the current experience. I'm going to pause there for a moment and repeat this line because I think it's really important. Maybe you were part of setting up the current experience. I think that can be a really hard thing to internalize. And it actually makes me think of an experience that I had earlier this year that I'd like to share to illustrate this point. So, I had the privilege of being part of a humanity centered, trauma informed masterclass cohort with people across the country who are really trying to innovate in the space of inclusion and make it more accessible to people, to really wrap our heads around it. And one of the modules was on design ethics. Um, and the facilitator shared a story about how their research rigor had an unintentional impact. So I'll provide a very high level summary of the story. But essentially, what I mean by their rigor is that they wanted to help a specific community. And in order to do that, they wanted to meet them in their community. So go to where they are. And they also wanted to do it frequently. They went every day, of a high frequency, because they wanted to interview as many people as possible, collect as many insights as they could, so that they could better serve this community. And in doing so, they showed up as themselves, and as though, although they were a part of that community, they did not present as such. What ultimately resulted from that frequency and the rigor of their research is that it created a suspicion of that community. It made them a target. And what inevitably happened is that that entire community was raided and many people were detained, which was devastating to this facilitator. That their rigor, while well intentioned, resulted in the exact opposite of what they were trying to work against. And when they told me that story, I had to mute my mic and turn off my camera because I was just weeping. because it had made me think about all of my experiences growing up with Child Protective Services weaving itself in and out of my life, and how every time CPS agents showed up to my school, it made me a target. People, it was a small town. People knew why they were there, they knew who they were talking to. And what was worse is my abusers at home also knew because it was such a small town. And so while they tried to help me, they actually made things worse, and I paid the price with every visit. And over time, I built all this resentment with this agency that was intended to help children like me. And it bred this level of distrust that made me skirt around the foster care system. And instead of being replaced or placed again, I decided to be homeless and just make it on my own and figure it out. So when this facilitator unpacked their thinking and acknowledged how, while it was well intended, it had this negative consequence, I was filled with so much grief and forgiveness at the same time that, you know what, those CPS agents were probably using the best tools they had available to them. They didn't know how to think about all of the magnitude of the consequences of their actions. And now here I am working in public sector as well, wanting to drive more equitable outcomes. And what if I'm in a position where my rigor has a negative consequence, like similar to me, similar to that facilitator? What grace can I extend? What does that process look like? So it made me really dig in deep in terms of like, this is part of the work, that self-reflection of what we do to hold ourselves accountable when we unintentionally stumble because we are trying to do our best. So I'm going to bring us back to the to the rest of Kim's quote. Um, and the quote reads, calling out these blockers can sometimes feel personal, but the effort of inclusivity is aimed to address societal inequity. Instead of taking it personally, know that you have the power to contribute to a greater solution. And as you come out of your comfort zone, being honest and transparent in your process will be critical to success. Rose-colored glasses can cause so much disparity. So confront your personal biases and challenge yourself to get the most value out of the process. So how does this inclusive design idea fit into the PEAR framework? So I had the privilege of getting to consume some of the orientation material. So I would like to share some of the insights that I found regarding the PEAR framework and inclusive design. From an inclusive design perspective, the lifeblood of the PEAR ecosystem is empathy-centered collaboration, of which includes acknowledging exclusion. And this happens to be one of the core principles of inclusive design thinking. So I'll just cover this as surface level. We're not going to do a deep dive into it for the sake of time, but just so you are aware, the three inclusive design principles are to recognize exclusion, to learn from diversity, to solve for one and extend to the many. I felt it was important to at least touch base on this as we talk about the relationship with PEAR. So when I think about PEAR and inclusive design, I think processes help us engage with a range of communities to build up the PEAR ecosystem. So for PEAR, I think of it as a framework, an ecosystem, an engine to deliver an empathy-centered outcome. Inclusive design is like a process or thought work that helps us get there. So building a strong PEAR ecosystem is not a solely external practice. It will require internal work to meet these goals and objectives. And what I really aim to cover here is to help do that internal work, because it's not talked about enough. There's this assumption that you're all good, just like dive in, make it happen. But there's a little more to it. So to fundamentally understand that acknowledging the suffering of others doesn't diminish our own is important. And it's hard to internalize sometimes. In fact, it can help us tap into what it means to be empathy centered. it's not just about recognizing it for others, but also for ourselves. We are part of that network too. And if we don't do this internal work, we run a very high risk of burning ourselves out, which serves no one. Taking care of ourselves is taking care of our communities. So, a few overlaps that I've seen. Um, so, inclusive design fits into the heart work that is foundational to PEAR, and it aligns to building authentic relationships, collaborative decision making, continuous growth journey, genuine accountability. And on the slide, I have an image of one of the PEAR orientation slides that's about relational partnership that reads the same bullets that I just articulated. Another interesting cross pollination moment is the 4 basic needs for engagement. I thought this was really interesting too, of trust, hope, sense of worth, and feeling competent. That is also embedded within inclusive design thinking. It's a natural extension of the two. And then the last one here, and I apologize for the overlap, but inclusive design also aligns with PEAR strategies for establishing relational partnerships, of which include identifying your biases, understanding your agency culture. For example, where are the barriers to the supportive community and relational partnership? These are critical questions that we ask in the design process, design and research. And then also ultimately a people first mentality. So ultimately, inclusive design thinking empowers us to lean into the mindset of truth, healing, and reconciliation. Something compelling I found among the PEAR framework is describing it as an engine of reconciliation. I really love the way that's phrased because it makes me think of how that engine is powered and maintained. I think inclusive design can be a foundational part of the fuel and a sustained maintenance. So, coming back to this idea that systemic change requires self reflection. When thinking about the PEAR engine and how it can be accelerated by inclusive design, it leads me to think about how we can show up as whole people in our work. Because the reality is that when it comes to driving equitable outcomes, personal work is required to do our best professional work. So, what I have here is a framework of what it looks like in order to do that. And really, what that means is we need to start asking questions. So, with that in mind, I've curated a collection of self reflective exercises that I've observed to help individuals, teams, and organizations working in this space. So, for the sake of time, I'll walk through them. I won't read every bullet as I will be sharing these materials and you can take time to digest it further. But I will give an example for each section, which is self, team, and organization. So, some questions to seed self-reflection that I found to be really helpful across public and private sector, working with individuals in this space, is kind of related to the story I shared earlier. Can you think of an example of how your professional rigor may have unintentionally harmed someone else? What steps could have been taken to reduce or prevent that harm? And what steps or procedure can you personally put in place to prevent that form of harm again? There's a similar framework that we can shift into teams to think reflectively. So, one particular question to seed that team discussion that I found that works really well is presenting a scenario. And then in that scenario, your leader wants everyone to be more intentional in deepening their abilities around cultural humility and competencies in their work. What recommendations would you want to share to help them achieve this goal? What's great about this particular scenario is you could do it individually and then share your answers, or you can do it collectively, depending on how comfortable people feel, because we're all coming at this from different angles and levels of comfort. Sorry for the brightness. And then lastly, preparing an organization for organizational conversations, which can be a little bit more involved. But some scenarios that have worked really good for seeding organizational conversation is, what has your organization done to build trust and foster a safe environment to be honest and transparent? And this can bring up a lot of stuff. So it's important to make sure that you create a space to have honest and transparent conversations. Another one is, what does trust look like in your organization? Are you aligned? Is it mixed? And what barriers of trust exist that prevent honest and transparent conversations to create change in your organization? It could be different depending on teams, but collectively, what barriers exist? So I've seen these work really well with individuals, teams, and organizations that are rumbling with these questions. So with that, I'm going to conclude with something that we often refer to in our Inclusive by Design team, that it always resonates. It always brings us back to our central, ideology of what makes us want to do this work in a systemic way. I have an image of a tweet, and the tweet reads, "A bunch of people aren't going to be able to get on this bus, and my one wheelchair spot takes up 4 seats total. So I was apologizing to everyone, and this woman turned around and went, 'It's not your fault they designed the buses like this.' And it was exactly what I needed to hear." So where does this leave us? As professionals that are actively engaged in making public systems better for all, we have a responsibility to shape a future that is both diverse and inclusive. When technology fails to meet someone's needs, we can't look at them and say, "You should have fit in the bus better." We have to look at ourselves and ask, why did I design the bus like this? So with that, I encourage everyone to think proactively about access and accessibility within efforts of equity and inclusion. We can't possibly achieve equity without thinking about accessibility. And none of this critical work can be done sustainably without making space for ourselves to show up as whole people. So with that, in this deck I'm providing you, I have some additional resources if you're interested. I'll also have my contact information if you want to ask me questions directly. There's some more resources there, and that's it. So thank you so much. And if we have time for questions, I'm open to it.
Yeah, we definitely do.
Yeah.
I'll feel free to raise your hands or jump in, folks, if you want to ask Jen any questions.
So it probably depends on your comfort level, but when it's trying to recognize, what I'm trying to work on is recognizing when I am the person that's not creating the inclusiveness. And I think that's, for me, that's something I want to try to, how do I help myself recognize that? And is it just by reading the room?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's hard to read a room when you don't know all the language, right? And I think sometimes when it comes to taking ownership of recognizing when we might not be thinking as inclusively, oftentimes I see the tension comes from not either giving ourselves enough space to reflect on that, or not having the space to think about it, to allow us to stumble into it, to ask those questions that we feel a little embarrassed to ask. And that's why it's so important to create those spaces, whether it's internally or like physical space to dialogue. It's almost like a lobby. Like, let's knock into this space. I'm going to ask some questions that might generally irritate other people, but how else am I supposed to learn this? How else am I supposed to know? So I think when we hear about like create space for people, yeah, what does that mean? I think for me it means cultivating an environment where you are allowed to stumble so you can learn. Or if you've already stumbled, to bring those reflections out and like, hey, I did this thing, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. So Dan, does that answer your question?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's that's just something I know I need to work on, is trying to recognize when I'm unintentionally doing that.
Right. And sometimes it's about like, do you feel comfortable enough asking someone like, hey, I think I misread that. Was there something that I said or did that maybe came off wrong, or maybe my intentions like were mismatched? And some people are open to that. Some people may not be as receptive, but you can't control how other people will react to your natural curiosity to want to think more inclusively, or at least understand what the boundary was to begin with. I think that is a big part of it, is what is the boundary? What does it mean to read the room? What language are we collectively speaking?
And also having the comfort level of recognizing when somebody else does that and addressing it appropriately.
Yeah. Yeah, the addressing part is hard. I think what's been really helpful, and I have this in the end of the slides with like setting up the space and then questions to seed conversations, is just having a group agreement of, if I say something that is not okay, how do you want to be called in about it? And that I've had to implement in some pretty challenging situations, especially within public health, and say, and having to be called in and like, hey, I prefer, if I did something or said something, I prefer to have a one-on-one conversation. I don't want to read about it. I would prefer to have like either in person or a virtual call, so that there's no tone that's being left unchecked, or that there's no opportunity for more assumptions. So that's just me personally, but there are others who prefer indirect means of being called in if a line is felt to have been crossed. And that has been successful for a lot of teams, at least that I've seen in this space.
So one thing that in IT we're exploring as a way to be more inclusive by design is um, establishing working agreements or team agreements, but not just for like the team, right? Because we have our values and our mission, our vision, our goals, all those things. But we're actually looking at that as establishing for our charter for like what our meetings are about. And I feel like we've been at this now for a couple weeks, and I feel like we're seeing some progress, right? Because this is new experiment for us overall. But super excited by that opportunity. We won't be perfect with it, but it's a goal in the right direction, I feel.
Yeah, I love hearing that. I think the having it on a team level of how you want to engage and what's serving us and what's not. Sometimes we're like given these scripts of engagement that are just not working for us within our realm of influence. So I think it's really smart to have those, more granular charters, so that your work can be more meaningful to you and your time is better spent. And I think um, an extension of that too, I've seen more people almost have self charters, for lack of a better term, of just what is my way of working, like what works for me to show up as a whole person, what are my behaviors if I'm triggered in a certain way, what is my aftercare when I've put myself out there to do this and then I feel the feels of it. How is it that I'm taking care of myself so that I can return to my team the next day? um, I think that approach of the more granular charter on the team leads to these other internalized conversations that are really helpful for us to do this work in the long term.
That's Jen, I just got to jump in there. That's a really interesting way of think about self-reflection. Like I've never thought of writing down, and I know once we say like a charter, that seems like that's so like official and it's in Microsoft Word and all of that stuff. But it's thinking about like really saying out loud or writing it down of like what do I stand for? How do I, some of the questions that you have for the self-reflection is like, when you talk about like, essentially like, intention versus impact of like
Yeah.
the rigor of the work that you do. And you're not realizing, I mean, I sometimes only think about the people that I interact with that, but I don't think of like that ripple in, um, the water that goes further out and further out and touches more and more people because of what I had done here, for good or bad. So that's good food for thought. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. It looks like we have a hand raised. Heidi?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Jen. That was great. I look forward to reading through the slides again. I appreciated the reference that you made to the bus. Why wasn't the bus designed differently? And so just kind of the physical inclusive reference. To me, the challenge is sometimes when things aren't necessarily visible, being inclusive and designing things in an inclusive way when sometimes we aren't even aware of all the issues that are out there and that other people are experiencing. So it's not necessarily a question, just kind of more of an observation. So, but thank you. It was a really interesting presentation.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's hard to, cover all of the things when you don't know.
Right.
And I think that's what's particularly interesting around digital accessibility, what as it relates to Section 508, because part of that accessibility framework is something really simple, and that is, how are you collecting feedback when something isn't functioning the way that it's supposed to, or there's a barrier to access? How do people reach out to you? And that's something that's interestingly overlooked a lot in accessibility, and why that we're seeing a lot of remediation cases rising just because of a lack of communication, a line of reference of, hey, I noticed this thing, you missed it. Can you help me gain access to the thing that you designed for me to access? So I think there's a beautiful nugget of humanity in that, of just providing the feedback loop so we can, not make assumptions that we know everything, because we don't.
Well, I did this silly exercise because I'm trying to, and goes to that intent versus impact, and trying to understand that trickle effect that Kristen kind of was just describing. I trying to help with the kind of digital modernization, right? That's obviously part of my job. And so I created a form, with like a survey question, asked some questions, and I sent it out to my peer group, the CIO peer group across the state. Said, hey, I want to test this out. I want to know if it works, and I need your help. So, send me the information. And basically, I just put like 5 questions in and said, can you read this question? And yes, no, and just trying to like use the different format of the survey tool so I could kind of just, hey, does this work? And does it work outside of my agency successfully? And it did. And I got a lot of good feedback. Good idea, great way to, test out the theory. And then I got one from the School of the Blind, and she's like, and it's accessible too. It's like it meets the ADA requirements. I didn't even know that. I didn't even know that about the tool itself. So, yeah, sometimes when you do stuff like that, or you just try to explore, you gain some knowledge around things. And I'm happy because Sarah is, Sarah Conley, her and I met, and I showed her the tool. I was like, hey, I did this thing, and here's what I learned. And then when I met with her last week, she's like, guess what? I'm doing this thing. We're going to pilot and use this tool, try this out and see how it works. And so, small little incremental, changes, right? And so that's what I like about this, and just kind of the thought, like, we don't have to try and do this all at once. Like you said, it's incremental change. And I think we as an agency are really trying to evolve that way. And Kristen's doing a great job helping us, I think, understand what that PEAR framework's about, and incrementally bringing it into our, our realms, our spheres of work that we do, so that we can kind of try and continue to evolve. So I really appreciate, Kristen, you bringing Jen in and helping her bring us to us so we can have this next evolution. Thank you.
Of course. Wow, that is, I love hearing that. And that's all, I mean, I know it seems simple, but it's an amazing and kind of intoxicating snowball effect when you can provide like one lane of access, and how that changed for, even if it's a small group of people, but then that also means you get that much more feedback. And then that gets to inform the next lane of access, and then the one after that, and then the one after that. So it makes me really happy to hear that you have that experience. And I'm also very grateful for both Crystal and Kristen for inviting me to talk with you all today, because it's such a amazing thing that you all do, and I'm really excited for the state of Washington and what's happening with this transformational time in governance. So it's challenging, but it feels very much worth the effort.
Very cool. Well, with that said, I wanted to thank both Jen and another person behind the scene, Julian, who's lurking in the dark. No, just kidding. For coming to us today and working with me in the past and coming with us today. And I will definitely follow up with both of them. And for the team here, Crystal, were you recording this?
No, I see that it's being recorded, but I did not
Okay.
press the record button.
So whomever is recording, I was about to record it. So whomever is recording it, please let me know, because I do want to share with all of the folks that were invited who are not able to attend. And then I do want to make sure that Jen and Julian get a copy of this as well. So they have that for their records. So with that said, I want to again thank Jen and Julian. Jen will forward her contact information. So if there's questions that you want to have offline that you might feel more comfortable with, please do so. Jen's more than happy to, I don't want to speak for you, but you did say that Jen would be more than happy to talk to you about that. So LT, thank you for being here today. Folks from my DEI committee, thank you for being here today. OLT, if you want to hang on the phone here with me, then we can continue with our fun meeting. But with that, thank you very much.